Hey, everybody out in the world of the progress report. You know, this long-running, highly anticipated every week, massively watched show that I've done with Mike Farley. When we started, did you have some hair? I can't remember.
Oh, that's a low blow to start the show.
Well, it
that's
was.
All
I don't know
say.
why I did
the
that.
The short answer is no, Bob. Even way back then, I was still a cue ball.
Well, a handsome one at that. So we are back with one of our favorite guests on this program, and that is none other than John Clayton, the Executive Director of the Manchester Historic Association. When he comes on, he always has interesting stories to tell about Manchester and its past. And I'm a big fan of John's because I think every city needs a bard to sing its music, tell its stories. And with John Clayton, we have a really outstanding person who can do that better than anybody I've ever known. And he's now in a position which he should be in, Executive Director of the Manchester Historic Association. And under his leadership, the Historic Association has advanced and thrived down at their Millyard Museum, which is a very unique and wonderful museum. I'm sure probably everybody watching the show has visited. If you haven't, you certainly should. He mounts some really excellent exhibits, and they keep coming up, and they're always very, very, very worth going to see. And so, John, welcome. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for the kind words.
Yeah, well, you've earned them. Some of the things I wanted to talk with John about today is, he's always got new things going on at the Millyard Museum, putting up special exhibitions, and I think he's got one going now and another one planned. And some time ago, we did a very interesting one on the history of public health in the city of Manchester. And we were just talking about the terrific job our public health people do here in the city, Anna Thomas and Phil Lexikos, as they've wrestled with this pandemic. And that's going to lead into the other subject I asked John to be prepared to talk a little bit about, which I'll call pandemics then and pandemics now. Probably everybody knows that the last time we had a pandemic that was this disruptive to the life of this whole country and much of the world was in 1918, the so-called Spanish flu, which hit around the world, hit the U.S. very hard, hit Manchester very hard. So it's interesting to think about, how we handled that just over 100 years ago, and now we've had this other pandemic, the COVID pandemic, arrive and, disrupt our lives for now a year and counting. It was really, in March that we really shut everything down here. I'm recalling when I was watching some news on TV, and I think it was March 12th or 13th, John, I heard the NBA had canceled their season.
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, was the sign. This was a big, big deal. One of our
Bob,
major...
Bob, can I jump in there, Bob?
You may.
To me, when they canceled the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Manchester was the one that really hurt really bad.
Yeah. Well, that would hurt you really bad because you're a big part of that effort every year. But I tell you, I just knew that this was going to be a national big deal when the NBA said we're canceling our entire season. And this was pretty early on. It was certainly happened in March. And we've all been living with a lot of things since then. So anyhow, John, I've talked too much here. You want to introduce yourself any more than I did? Or?
No, I don't think it's necessary. But the timeline we're following is a little bit confusing. So relative to the Spanish flu epidemic, back in 2008 when I was writing for the Union Leader, a book came out called Pandemic 1918. And I was fascinated by the book and how the Spanish flu affected the rest of the world. And I decided to do what I do, which is to look through my little Manchester window and see how this community was affected by that. So I wrote a column about it, and what I learned was astounding. So in 2008, the paper published that as a matter of course, one of my 2 columns a week. And as this pandemic was starting to rear its ugly head back in March of last year, the paper called me and asked me if they could possibly reprint that column from 2008, not as a panic device, but to kind of presage what we might be looking for. And it ran on March 15th, right in the midst of that week when everything was coming together or falling apart. And the response was amazing.
Really?
And people were just like, this can happen. And what I find so gratifying
So,
now
so
is
this column was published for the second time when?
in March 15th of
March
last year,
15th last year.
the day after the NBA canceled its
My
season.
goodness.
Someone at the paper thought
Boy, that was very timely.
well, I am nothing if not timely. But they called and asked if they could reprint it, and I felt that the public health message within the column was so important that how could I say no? And come to find out since that among the first readers of that piece in the Sunday paper was Anna Thomas, who's director of our city health department.
Yes.
And she has since told me that that absolutely gave her the sense of the measures they might have to take and might have to take very quickly.
Well,
John,
Go.
can I jump into the conversation here?
Please do, Michael.
You certainly point out excellently that our public health department saw this and appreciated what it could become, but they were a small group of people. There was a real push to downplay back at that time what this was all about. I'm wondering, what did they do in 1918 when the soldiers were coming back? Did they recognize what they were up against at first, or did they also try to downplay it?
It was a little bit before the soldiers were all coming home. It first hit in Manchester, Michael, on September 16, 1918. That's when the Union leader reported the first case, not having realized that a gentleman had died 2 days earlier from the Spanish flu. It just wasn't sussed out, if you will. So the soldiers started coming home after the armistice, November 11, 1918, and there were all kinds of theories that they were bringing the flu home in the mud on their boots from the trenches. Did the Germans try to poison us by affecting the aspirin that they produced over in Germany? So people downplayed it. People tried to write it off as a conspiracy theory. Doesn't that sound familiar? But in the end, the public
Sure
impact
does.
was so dramatic and so rapid. In one 48-hour period here in Manchester, 41 people died in 48 hours. As you may have read from my piece, every hospital bed was taken. Mayor Moisey Verrett met with all the furniture dealers in the city to beg them for beds because they simply didn't have enough beds to accommodate the people who were dropping in the street from the Spanish flu.
no kidding. Wow.
They put out a plea for people with automobiles because in 1918, cars were not that prevalent. The fire department was running ragged transporting patients to the hospitals. So again, Mayor Verrett reached out to motor vehicle owners to see if they could not commandeer their cars, but volunteer them to drive patients to the hospitals.
So in this past year, we've had grave concerns about the degree of illnesses and serious illnesses overwhelming the capacity of our healthcare facilities, particularly our hospitals. Did that happen in the 1918-19 too?
Yeah, without benefit of the word surge. Again, every hospital in Manchester was full to the capacity. They tried to get public spaces like the Circle National Club to allow them to use their space as a clinic or ER, if you will. So everything that we've experienced now happened then. The police quickly, on the advice of the Board of Health, in the first week after that September 16th diagnosis, they shut down every movie theater and all the schools in Manchester. Eventually it was pool halls and bowling alleys, and the ripple effect was not unlike what we've just experienced here in 2020 and 2021. The police had to be careful. Priests and rabbis and ministers were being asked to go administer last rites to folks in their home. 5 Catholic priests died of the Spanish flu, having acquired it from providing absolution for those people who were dying in their homes. So the checklist is pretty extraordinary, and when you match it up to where we are today, the parallels are uncanny. So history, according to my good friend Ken Burns, history doesn't repeat itself.
But it rhymes.
But it has echoes and it rhymes.
It rhymes.
Exactly. And I think we're seeing that 103 years after.
My goodness. You would think that back in 1918 and 1919, going forward more than 100 years, we would have had far better tools to deal with this than they did then. And I'm sure in many ways that's true. But, what did they have any idea of how to treat this disease or how to prevent its continuing expansion?
The union leader actually published an article on how to make your own gauze mask with 8, we're all talking about masks today.
We are indeed.
They had do-it-yourself homemade mask recipes on the front page of the newspaper, realizing even then that the best preventive measure you could take against contracting the flu was to wear a mask. and avoid large congregations, no social distancing. And the lessons learned are amazingly close to those that were learned over 100 years ago.
And did the government respond then like it has this time with, mask mandates? Or, was there states of emergency declared? We've had a continuing state of emergency that's only now being, lifted in the state of New Hampshire from Governor Sununu. That happened in 1918-19.
Nothing close to the extraordinary effort we've seen this time, now, not earlier, but now. In fact, in Philadelphia, the virulent period started in September. The Mummers Day Parade in Philadelphia is absolutely a civic staple. And the organizers insisted on going forward with that parade just before Thanksgiving. And that, to me, is the first super spreader event that we had here.
That was in November 1918.
November 1918. And then all of a sudden it's in New York, it's in Boston, and boom, it's in Manchester.
Mm-hmm.
John, can I jump in there and point out that at about the same time in St. Louis, they decided to cancel a major parade, and St. Louis managed to ride out the pandemic with only, let's say, minor damage compared to what ended up happening in Philadelphia. So there was actually a control on that experiment, and it proved out.
Government action, of a preventive nature, oftentimes isn't effective because people don't see the harm. It hasn't happened yet. So that kind of a preemptive strike, which is so critical to containing something like this, can be a hard sell sometimes.
Yeah.
John, I wanted to ask, you were talking about government action and declaring states of emergency, and I love the stories about real municipal government in action where the mayor is personally calling people to try to borrow their cars. Gotta love that. But this is pre-1929, pre-Depression, pre-FDR. Economically, I got to imagine the government just kind of left people on their own for this one, and that must have been devastating to the working day people of Manchester.
It was really hard because even though we weren't in a depression, after the Great War here in Manchester, all the federal contracts to make uniforms for the soldiers had dried up or were drying up. So there money that Amuskeg had been spending far too freely during the war, Daddy Warbucks money coming in from the federal government was in the process of drying up. So it was becoming more and more less, pardon me, said that backwards. It was becoming less and less prosperous in the city at the time. We were on the way to our first major strike at Amuskeg, which was in 1922. So again, in 1918, we weren't flush as we had been 4 years earlier. So the economic hardship was real. And Amuskeg had to shut down in November of 1918. The public health department, they were dropping like flies, the mill workers. And not unlike the meat plants, meat processing plants today or nursing homes, those mills were a rampant bed for infection. So the city government took the extraordinary step of shutting down a private company to say, no, you can't do this anymore.
What was the rate of death in that pandemic as compared to this one? Do you know?
It was over 620,000 people in the United States. So it's a little bit higher. Then we're at about 560 now, 560,000.
With a much smaller population at that time.
At that time, yes, yeah. Which again is indicative of how widespread it was.
Yeah.
In New Hampshire, in the span of, let's say, 6 months, 2,700 people died, which is far more than we've had die in New Hampshire. But in Manchester, 527 people died in that first wave of infection. So,
which went from, November 1918, and how long did it last?
Really, September of 1918 is when it first arrived and spread quickly. So they had surges, as we do now. So after the Christmas holidays, it slowed down because people weren't congregating as they had been before. But there was a second wave in the summer of that year. So it was both 1918 and 19. We branded on that 1 year, but the effects were felt a long time. Yeah. And in the same way, we're experiencing what they're calling long haulers now.
Yes.
People who had been infected with the COVID virus experiencing those long-term symptoms. Yeah. The Spanish flu was the same. In fact, they talked about the feeble-minded who were affected by the after effects of having had the Spanish flu.
Wow.
And it was, again, amazingly similar to what we're experiencing today.
In this COVID pandemic, we've had plenty of criticism of the federal leadership on this, particularly under the last administration, But I understand that at the time of the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, the President of the United States was Woodrow Wilson. And I understand he never mentioned it. Do you know if that's true, that there was no federal response to this whatsoever?
That is my understanding. It was basically, as Michael said earlier, it was mayors and governors who took it upon themselves, as their responsibility to protect their people. And the federal government really had its hands full with the Great War. They were still trying to fight that and end that war. So the focus was more on the war than it was on this pandemic as it swept through the country.
But the war ended, 2 months after the outbreak?
After the first hit.
And then the pandemic went on long after that.
And again,
you would think that the federal government would have shifted some resources, some of its capabilities to dealing with this dreadful mass disease.
They were actually compounding the problem because when the war ended, there was a quick evacuation of the U.S. troops that were stationed in France and Belgium. And so they were coming home in droves, many of them infected, and bringing it back here. So rather than calming it at the end of the war, actually exacerbated the problem as it was here in the United States.
Wow. And what was the state of knowledge at that time about what was effective to treat this? I mean, we've had a long, really a steep learning curve about this COVID pandemic, ventilators and, antibody treatments, which I guess is a little iffy as to whether they really were all they were cracked up to be, as I'm reading. But, what did they do to try and save the people who contracted this disease way back 103 years ago?
The medical care was, given we're a century back, was incredibly primitive compared to what we have today. So they would have started hydration. That was a big problem for people who contracted it. But the level of infection, the number of bodily systems that were affected by it, it wasn't just your lungs. And we know COVID is not just your lungs now, but it was the totality of the impact on the body. Deterioration in the lungs, spontaneous bleeding from the mouth and nose, and these terrifying symptoms. So they did whatever they could. And unfortunately, again, here in Manchester, lost 527 patients and thousands more, permanently affected by the effects of that disease.
And they had their own long haulers, as you say. People, not everybody, but a very significant numbers, had to live with the effects of this disease going on and limiting them.
And from that book I mentioned, if I may read for a second.
Please.
Convalescence was often painfully slow, according to Influenza 1918, a book by Lynette Izoni. Quote, feeble recovering patients hobbled like invalids, gasping for breath. Some remained stone deaf, others developed disorders of the heart, lung, and kidneys, and often not just the body, but the mind remained feeble. So before we had our long haulers, the Spanish flu created its own empire of long haulers.
My goodness. Now, there was never a vaccine developed to deal with that pandemic, was there?
No, it's herd immunity.
It was herd immunity.
And it came
is that what eventually stopped it? So many people got sick that we did get to herd immunity?
Yeah.
Is that what the general teaching is?
Yes, and obviously it came at a great cost in human life.
Great cost. My goodness.
John, how long did this impact the schools in Manchester?
Well, again, as we did in this case here in Manchester, Mike, they shut them down immediately, under orders of the health department, and the goal was to reopen, and so they started reopening them after that winter, the first winter surge, getting into March and April, thinking, the fresh air, people will be better, and it still didn't prevent the second surge or second wave from hitting Manchester.
So, John, we now have, along with Nashua, we're the only two cities in New Hampshire that do have a public health department. Mm-hmm. Thank God we do in this time. I think it's just been, and these people have been, I can't say enough about, their capabilities and their work ethics and their caring.
And one of the oddities in Manchester is that the school nurses do not work for the school department. They work for the public health department.
Oh, really?
Because early on, Manchester knew that schools were a potential hotbed for the spread of disease amongst children. So the nurses were in the school, at every school, simply to keep an eye on the health of the general population.
So did we have a public health department back in those days too?
We did. Yep.
Yeah.
Beginning in 1854, I believe. That's from our public health
exhibit.
What a progressive
city Manchester was, huh?
Huh?
I said, what a progressive city Manchester was back at the turn of the century, huh?
You probably have to thank the Amuskeg for that, because they pretty much did everything for the city, didn't they?
And if we have some images, you'll see that reinforced.
Oh, do you have some images?
Well, I don't know, Mike. I had sent you some photos earlier.
I think we're ready. Can we ready to look at some of those images? Can we do that now? and maybe have John tell us what they're showing
on the screen.
Oh, look at this, folks. Look at this.
Love this shot. This was taken in September of 1918.
Wow.
Before the pandemic hit. This is a Red Cross nurses rally at Textile Field. They were gathering together to raise money for the Red Cross to help with the war effort, not knowing that they were on the eve of a battle that would change their lives.
Change their lives big.
The battle against Spanish flu.
Yeah. Of course, everybody knows that's now Gill Stadium.
Yes.
And look at this fine group of.
Well, this you mentioned Amuskeg. They were incredibly progressive in the way they tried to care for their employees. So they had nurses on hand throughout the mill yard. Early in the pandemic, they were important because they would identify those who had become infected. And again, they had to protect themselves at the same time. But this is an example of the kind of progressive attitude Amuskeg had taken to protect employees in the workplace.
My goodness. I wonder how many of those people got sick themselves, those ladies.
Unfortunately, that was a very frequent side effect.
Yeah, which has been true in this epidemic too. I mean, this pandemic too.
And in this case, this is one of the operating doctor's offices they kept in the mill yard for Amuskeg. So if you got hurt on the job, industrial accidents were not uncommon. Right. You could be treated right there and later moved to the hospital. But that was, again, part of the vision, part of the chain of command in terms of providing care.
Wow.
From Amuskeg.
Wow.
And back then, the city had 3 major hospitals. This is the original Notre Dame de Lourdes Hospital, which is now a part of Catholic Medical Center. That's the portion on Notre Dame Avenue.
Yeah.
So imagine that full to the rafters. And then the Elliott Hospital had its own facility up on the east side, the east side of the city.
So that's the Elliott, I guess.
That's part of the original Elliott Hospital building.
Elliott Hospital, my goodness.
And again, that structure would have been filled, every bed filled with Spanish flu patients.
Wow, those are quite the pictures, John. Thank you for providing them for us. At what point did we get out of that pandemic? When was it finally?
It was really
no
late.
Longer.
Yeah, late in 1919.
Late in 1919.
So again, we're in the 13-month period right here.
Yeah.
And so the city went through an 18-month devastation. And again, the only cure was that herd immunity.
And then as now we were asked to wear masks. I think that's just fascinating, that the same basic protection, which is not a high-tech solution,
A century later, unless you count those N95 masks.
Yeah, the N95 masks are probably better than what they could offer then, but most people aren't wearing them. It's if you're in a healthcare business, you probably are. And
yeah.
So forth, but that and it was understood that you need to be quarantined and separated from others, and so they understood something about the transmissibility of this illness through
airborne.
Airborne, yeah.
Yep.
Was there a concern about transmission through surfaces? Because we had a period of time going on for months when everybody was very concerned about sanitizing the surface everywhere. Don't touch, come in, wash your hands.
Yep.
Spray disinfectant everywhere.
Well, yeah, so there was a real concern.
Try not to use cash, and if you're going to use money, put it in the oven and bake it. Which my wife did that once, more than once, I think.
There was concern about contact, and it's evident through some of the regulations or enforcements that were put in place. Restaurants were ordered to boil their dishes for 10 minutes before they were reused.
Yeah.
Even if you were dining outdoors. The shutdown on the bowling alleys and the pool halls was because of fear of contact tracing. Owners didn't want to have to take every bowling ball after you played it, put it back and start again. There was concern that it might be transmissible by surface.
And did they also shut down bars and restaurants at that time?
Boom, absolutely.
For how long did that last?
Well, Police Chief Michael Healy loved the fact that they shut down the bars, in spite of his Irish ancestry, because it eliminated the problems they had dealing with drunks, and that was to their liking. But no, all the bars and saloons were closed. Restaurants ultimately had to go to outdoor dining. Church services only outdoors.
John, at that time, Manchester had a lot of bars. It's many more than we have now. Am I correct? Or
no, you are. Yeah, you're
just wishful thinking.
No, we had up to 50 saloons in the greater downtown area, and they weren't vast in size, but they were many in number. And so they were shut down. And I'm sure the owners.
Let me ask this: we have it's almost kind of become. I don't know, a totem for some people. What was the public reaction, if you're able to tell from the news reporting that you've looked at? What was the public reaction? Did they join the team and try to solve this problem, or did they fight kicking and screaming every step of the way, like we've seen in some communities here today?
I'm certain there would have been some resistance and, arguing personal freedoms, but I think the prevailing sentiment was absolute terror. People, were not as aware then. We don't have the media back then as we have now, where you can spew disinformation and, convince people of something that's not based in science. Back then, people read the paper and the doctors told them what they should be doing. And I think it was a far more accepted practice to quarantine when requested. When you're watching your friends and neighbors die, it's a pretty compelling story, and one I think would make people more obliged to follow whatever suggestions the health department made.
My goodness. It's just astonishing the parallels between them and now, then and now. And yet, what's the death toll in Manchester from this current pandemic? Do you have a rough estimate?
I should know as a consumer of news, but I don't have a great number on it. I don't think it's over 100, but I hope I'm wrong by a lot.
Well, if you're in the right ballpark, way fewer than died
back in
the Spanish
1918
flu, and we may hope that, as with the Spanish flu, so-called, we've now crested, and the thing is coming down. But there's still lots of worrying signs out there, aren't there?
There are, and I refuse to let up. I went into a restaurant the other day, and the bartenders who'd been wearing masks all along weren't wearing them, so I turned around and walked out.
Yeah.
I'm not going to spike the ball before we cross the goal line is one of the metaphors I've been hearing. Yeah. If we hang on for another month, we'll be immeasurably better off than if we start letting our guard down now.
Yeah. Well, in this one, the great difference is that we've had the miracle of the rapid development of 2, 3, 4 maybe vaccines that are widely proclaimed to be both safe and efficacious. And I'm happy to say I've now had 2 shots, and only a few more days to get to the end of the waiting period to be as fully protected as these things can do. And nothing like that happened with regard to the 1919 pandemic. And it's interesting to me that these vaccines came about so rapidly. Our former president wanted to claim it was his thing because it was warp speed, but I don't believe he's a scientist. And my understanding I've heard is that one reason this was able to happen so fast is that we were thinking we might need to have vaccines because of other pandemics that nearly got here. But somehow the public health people managed to stop it before they became worldwide pandemics, like SARS,
and Ebola,
and some of these other things. So that the basic requirements for making a vaccine were ready to be used. Yes. And so that's a wonderful thing that we have that happening. I think it's just miraculous that since the administration announced today that they've way met their goal of
over 200 million.
200 million vaccinated within the first 100 days of the new administration. I think it's just a really remarkable testament to the capability this country still has.
Well, here in Manchester, one of our own, Dr. Sam Katz, was among the developers of the measles vaccine. Mm-hmm. And then I remember personally walking to West High School with my mom and our neighbors to get the polio vaccine. So the scientific community is just an amazing group of people in what they do, how they respond to crises. Yeah. And, I'm living proof of that. I got my polio vaccine when it was the scourge of people everywhere in America.
Oh, boy, do I remember that,
John, I wanted to bring that up because that's, it wasn't a pandemic, but it certainly had a big impact. It impacted the way kids went to school, how they were taught. And I wonder, I didn't know if you might not be ready, but I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because some folks still walking around might remember that.
Well, certainly, and obviously President Franklin Roosevelt was a victim of polio in his childhood. But around my era, I think the vaccine came out in 1960 or 61, we had neighborhood kids who had polio. We were not allowed to swim in pools if kids with polio were in the pool. And I don't know if that was folklore, if that was my parents' ruling, but it was
Well, my parents had the same ruling.
a terrifying prospect. Yeah, we had
Yeah.
this public health exhibit we're talking about. We had some great old nursing school photographs, and one of them was a young nurse reading a comic book to a kid in an iron lung. And the iron lung was one of the ways in which you treated polio victims. And to look at the photograph is to remember the fear. Even as a 6 or 7-year-old, there were, don't do that, this might happen. So, yeah.
I certainly remember being told you can't go in the water, desperately anxious to go in the water on a hot summer day. Can't go in.
Nope.
And, I guess the iron lung was the ventilator of its day, was it?
Yeah, it was. Before Michael Jackson had his own hyperbaric chamber, they were used for purposes just like that.
Yeah. My goodness.
I can remember they did the vaccinations or in the school. The kids, you'd all line up and get your shot in the school. And they're doing that again now, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think when the Salk polio vaccine was developed, and then there was the Sabin one, which was even better, I guess, or easier to administer. I don't think there was a whole lot of opposition to getting those vaccines, was there?
To the contrary, again, I think people were terrified, and fear was a great motivator in terms of getting the vaccine.
Yeah.
I just think, again, given today's media, the conspiracy theories are just being fanned into greater flames, whereas back at that time, I don't think you had those radical media elements that would stoke fear of a vaccine as opposed to fear of the disease itself.
Yeah. I was seeing a news report of some poll. I don't want to make this a partisan thing, John, but I guess I'm going to have to, that 43% of Republicans are saying they don't want to get the vaccine.
And more than 50% of men, Republicans, so identified, are not going to get the vaccine.
Jeez. I just can't believe it. I just can't believe it. Because they do test these things very, very carefully, with large numbers of people. And we have one vaccine, the J&J vaccine, which looked like it was really the one to get because you only need one shot. And now that's been paused because of a tiny number, but of some very serious consequences. And I think that should give people a lot of confidence that our public health people really are looking out for us. That we should follow what they say. And again, not just Dr. Fauci, but is the lady who's now the head of the CDC. I mean, that's our preeminent public health organization in the world, and we have it right here in the U.S. So. So how's life for you now that did you say you just got your second shot?
Yeah, apparently in the nomenclature of the day, we were a Pfizer family.
Okay.
I've had my two. Colleen's had one. My daughter and son-in-law have had Pfizer as well.
Yep.
It doesn't matter. We weren't about to pick and choose.
No, right. Neither was I.
And I think the state did a good job of not saying what vaccine was being administered at what site in the beginning.
Yeah.
Obviously, 2 weeks ago when they had the J&J at the Loudon Speedway, it was announced before the fact. And two of my friends, a couple of young ladies who work for the Chamber of Commerce, had both gotten registered for that day. And, they're in their early 30s, and they were still excited about getting the vaccine because, being very active with the Chamber, one of the benefits is getting together with people. And we simply can't do that now. Yeah. So for a person like me who thrives on crowds, I've been going batty for more than a year now. I don't like doing the Temple of Dathia Shurin Brotherhood Sunday talk through Zoom. And I'll be doing that in 2 weeks anyway. I did an AARP program for the ARPNH 2 days ago. I don't like doing that on Zoom. So, me, I need an audience.
You need an audience, yeah. And the audience appreciates you when you do appear every time.
Hey, John, can I turn the topic a little bit? You one of the things that you do is you run a museum, and a museum is nothing if it isn't a community interaction. Can you talk a little bit about how you've survived through the lack of the ability to have people in your museum, and what have you got in mind for the future? What's up now and what's coming?
Good questions all, Mike. The Milliard Museum is in a building that's owned by U.S. First Robotics. It's a science-based organization. So from the get-go, we have been adhering to whatever protocols they put before us. So like many others, we went into absolute shutdown from March 16. But we were lucky. We were able to reopen on July 1 with a limitation of 30 people in the museum at a given time, masks required, social distancing. But at the same time we were able to open, we're really handicapped by this. We can't have any rentals or gatherings, and you know, you had a great Hibernian Christmas party a couple of years ago with a couple hundred people in there. And so we've lost a lot of revenue by not being able to have events. For me, the biggest loss is we can't have school field trips because we can't have a group of 30 kids piling onto a bus and coming to the museum. So we've tried to be nimble and still fulfill our mission of education for people who can't come to the museum. So last year we were producing fact sheets and worksheets for kids about historic people from Manchester's past. So our museum educator, Christy Ellsworth, did a great job. One day it would be a fact sheet about Ezekiel Straw, who laid out the city of Manchester. And it would be a fact sheet, but then she'd do a worksheet where kids could actually like trace your way from the mill to City Hall, crossword puzzles. And so that was helpful. But now we're going into a second year. We feel a need to do more. So we had some grant money from Amuskeg Industries earmarked for student field trips. We were able to turn that and hire a video company to do a virtual tour of the museum, 10 segments, in conjunction with the school district. They approved the scripts, and so now it's done. It's available to them on a limited basis on a password-protected YouTube channel, but those fourth grade teachers can now use it for hybrid learning, home learning, in school, and they've got the ancillary materials to go with it. So we've been trying to find ways to stay engaged with that audience, but again, having events at the museum, we did a walking tour of Victory Park on Saturday. We had actors from Majestic Theatre portray historic figures from Manchester's past, like Henry J. Sweeney and Lucien Goslin in costume. And because we were outdoors at Victory Park, we had more than 70 people sign up for the tour, which is great because it indicates the pent-up demand for things like this. But the Manchester Kiwanis is celebrating its 100th anniversary last year, and they wanted to celebrate. They have their breakfast meetings at the Mill Yard Museum, so they paid us a stipend for the year and have used like 10% of it. So they want to still have this gathering for their 100th year. We had it scheduled in December. It got moved to April. Now it's moved to September. And I have to tell them, if you held it on September and nothing changed, you can have 30 people at your event. So it's frustrating beyond measure. We're trying to do our Historic Preservation Awards, and we finally settled on the Rex Theater as the venue. And in meeting with Chuck Sturgill, he's helped us. It's like, right now I can have 75 people in here, and that's it. And normally we have more than 400 people. You've attended the event, and you know it's a great social event, a great networking event. It's our biggest fundraiser. Our virtual version last year was very well done, but it bombed financially. So we're just really as frustrated as everyone else. A museum without people is a warehouse. And I don't want to be the boss of a warehouse. I need people to come back. And again, if we all do the right things long enough, it'll happen soon enough.
So the Preservation Awards are usually in May, aren't they?
That's correct.
And is that going to be the case this year?
No, we simply knew that we wouldn't have the opportunity to bring people together. So that's why we moved it back to September 8th. For some arcane reasons, our fiscal year ends October 1, and by our bylaws, we have to have that event before the fiscal year ends.
I see.
So we're shooting for September 8, and fingers crossed, capacities will expand. And yet there's still the problem about people who might not want to come to a large public gathering.
That's
and
right.
We respect and understand that.
We need to see how that goes. Have you selected your awardees for this?
We have.
Year? Is that publicly available?
It is, except I don't know that I remember them all. One of the reasons we want to have it at the Rex Theater is they were a recipient last year.
Oh, sure.
And so we couldn't have it there. Last year, the Khalil House, which had been acquired by the Courier, was an award recipient, and we couldn't have it there. The Hebrew Cemetery in Manchester was beautifully restored, and we couldn't have the event with them there. So this year we hope to recognize them in a more formal way. They've got their plaques and awards, but for this year, let me think, who are we honoring?
Well, I don't need to put you on the spot about that.
I should know. I'm on the committee.
You know so much.
Well, among the honorees are the incredible group of volunteers who came together to help us save the Chandler house.
Yes.
That was a grassroots
Mike was
movement.
one.
Yeah. We were out there picketing on the sunny summer day because that was just an amazing grassroots effort. It came out of nowhere. You know, we started it. I started it by going to the 7 to Save Preservation Awards, but it snowballed from there. And we just think that kind of extraordinary community effort needs to be recognized. So I don't know who's going to go up and accept the plaque, but it ain't going to be me. we have a lot of.
John, I wanted to expand a little bit about that, because when you start talking about historic preservation, the saving of the Chandler House, and that was years in the making. That I'm going to say, even before you put it on the 7, it was on the 7 to save list. There was discussion going on. I can remember back, and it's been a long time now, when I was on the Heritage Commission, when Kate Markey came in and said, "Hey guys, you got to put this on your radar," and she certainly has been with it every step of the way as well. But can you talk a little bit about preservation in Manchester? I know it's not what the Historic Association does. I know there's a void in the city as far as organized preservation. But let me tell you, the Chandler House we won, but we've lost a lot in this city because it's an ad hoc thing. And if you don't get these crowds of people like yourself and Kate Markey and everybody else, then it just slides under the radar. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's been something of interest to me. I really think we need to get some organized preservationists going here in Manchester.
We have great friends in the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, but that's a statewide nonprofit that has no particular sway in any one community, and that's just the way it is in New Hampshire. Live free or die. I was gratified by that group coming together the way it did. To the point of creating Facebook pages and writing petitions to the bishop and picketing outside homes of the diocese that were, talking about tearing the building down. I got a call a couple of weeks ago from the school district saying, "What would you think if we shut down the Hallsville school?" And I said, I think it's a tragedy, but if it's absolutely necessary, adaptive reuse is what we preach every day. Find another use for the building, preserve its historic and structural integrity, but don't tear down the building. And I'm pretty sure my words won't fall on deaf ears, but it's about, sometimes you find out the day before. John Mongan was the mayor of Manchester, and he didn't know that B&M Railroad was tearing down their station until he looked out his window at City Hall and saw bulldozers and cranes moving into place.
Yeah, what an awful loss that was to the city. That was our own Penn Station, it was just awful.
The museum might be located in the station if it still existed. It was that beautiful building. So we talk about the Notre Dame Bridge, and we talk about, the State Theater and all of the items that are lost. And for me...
The Hill-LaSonde House.
Yeah, the Hill-LaSonde House on Hanover Street. It was a beautiful Italian-esque building that was torn down to make a parking lot. So, Joni Mitchell can sing about that all she wants, but when it happens, it hurts.
Yeah. So shouldn't there be some organization or some requirement under city ordinance or state law that you get notice for something like this is going to happen a little bit before the day but the bulldozers arrive?
Well, that was the concern with the Chandler House, because we kept waiting. I had spies in City Hall in the Planning and Zoning Department waiting to call me if the diocese actually went with an order of demolition, and that never came to that day. But that's one way to find out before. But when you talk to developers...
Can I take this moment, Bob, to point out that when I was chairman of the Heritage Commission, we researched, held public hearings, including many developers in the city of Manchester, and drafted a demolition review ordinance that was presented to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. It was opposed by Joe Kelly Lavasser, and it was tabled. And that ordinance, the Heritage Commission is looking again at it. I know they asked me to dig out my old files, and that ordinance could be pulled from the table tomorrow and reviewed, and we could have a real discussion in Manchester about taking a look at preservation and whether we need to just take a pause when we're going to tear down historic buildings. A lot of people don't realize this, but I personally have been working for years to try to get an ordinance like that through, and we're being blocked. And the prime mover who's blocking that was at the time Joe Lavasser.
Interesting. We're lucky, Mike, in that here in Manchester we have a couple of developers who don't just work in Manchester, but they have great respect for historic preservations, and they're big supporters of ours. And I'm referring specifically to Dick Anagnost and Arthur Sullivan.
Dick Anagnost participated heavily in the drafting of this ordinance. He came in and met with us on, I believe, two separate occasions, and provided tremendous input. He was a great influence on how the final product came out. That's sitting on the table in City Hall right now.
Yeah. In fact, Arthur Sullivan asked me if I would speak at an opening of a new mill building they've converted into apartments in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So I said,
Oh, really?
Arthur, why would you want me to go to Lawrence? He said, you're our good luck charm. You spoke at the unveiling of the Great American Flag.
Yeah.
You know, it was a huge success.
Yeah,
I
it
spoke
was.
at one in Nashua a couple years ago, and now they've done another one. So on May 24th, at his behest, they actually scheduled a meeting around me. I'm driving to Lawrence to be with the mayor of Lawrence and Arthur and talk about the opening of this great new
that should be
adaptive reuse mill building.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Is Hallsville the oldest school building still used as a school in
Yes,
the city of Manchester?
It is, yep.
So it does have real historic interest.
Oh, and it has great
And when you talk
historic
about
value.
readaptive uses, what sort of things might happen to that building that would help preserve it?
Well, one good example is the former Chandler School, where I went to kindergarten on the east side of Manchester, which had been purchased by Easter Seals and used as a learning center for many years. Well, about 3 years ago, it was bought by an engineering company, and they have done an amazing job of preserving the interior of the building. It's got the great old, dark wainscoting, and that's, again, adaptive reuse, and it's a great thing. So who would want to move into the Hallsville School? Look at the old Ash Street School, which is occupied by Silvertech.
Yeah.
And they are incredible stewards of that building.
Very much so.
So the hope would be that, a company with respect for history and, the interior design of that school is pretty remarkable, that they would preserve those elements. So even if it's not open to the public generally, it's something where we might look at their work and honor them for it if they choose to do so.
Maybe.
Hey, John.
Go ahead.
Can you, I'm sure you're familiar with this, can you tell the story about how the Hallsville School was stretched?
Well, yeah. The school was actually cut in half and expanded out both ways, and it was built back in the middle. I don't know the last time you walked into the school, Mike, but when you go in, the staircase to go up actually goes left and right, because when they extended the building, it didn't work as one staircase, so they've got left and right. And people don't believe you when you tell them that's how it happened.
And that was done because there was increasing demand at that time and needed more space?
Yeah, over in that neighborhood, the school was growing. That's a pretty densely
My
populated
goodness. No,
neighborhood.
I never heard that story. That's a dandy.
An engineering feat.
Yeah. Well, my goodness, this is just a fascinating discussion, as always is here. So I'd like to, just ask you, you've got lots of things going on. You got the Preservation Awards, and what you've given us about the pandemic then and now is just fascinating. But talk about your current special exhibition and what's coming up.
Yeah, we have a fascinating exhibit on the history of Pandora sweaters. And it's not specific to the industrial might of the company, although they produce 60,000 sweaters a week, which many people don't realize right here in Manchester. But it's about the design they worked. We had a woman who was a sweater designer there, a seamstress, and she saved every design pattern she ever used to create the original model that they would then replicate thousands of times over. And she sent them all to us about a year ago. And she sent the sweater itself that went with the pattern. So we just had this really unique resource about it. So our museum educator, Christy Ellsworth, said, let's do it based on design. So we have great manufacturing photos of the process at Pandora, but Ralph Sador is the son of May Gruber, who was the matriarch of Pandora.
Yeah.
He did a talk at the museum a couple of years ago about the history of Pandora. And we had over 120 people show up, most of them having been previous employees of Pandora. And so there's this affection for the company, which didn't close until 1990. And, it's still in the forefront of a lot of people's experience and memory.
Yeah.
They had that great the Canal Street factory store.
Yeah.
So you could get factory seconds. But I think about them as a Manchester company. They advertised in the New York Times Magazine, Women's Wear Daily. We have beautiful blow-ups of these illustrations. That's part of the exhibit. But it shows you the scale and scope of the company. May Gruber would personally drive to Macy's in Manhattan to close the deal for 5,000 sweaters for a holiday season. And to know that that was a going concern here in Manchester from 1940, they came in shortly after Amuskeg's bankruptcy and occupied what is now the home of the University of New Hampshire at Manchester. That was their factory. And they had this iconic sign atop the building that specifically was designed to be visible from the Everett Turnpike. So as folks were coming to New Hampshire, driving up to go skiing or go to the lakes, they would drive by and they would see this elegant scripted neon sign, home of Pandora sweaters. Well, when that sign came down about 2013, everybody clamored for the Historic Association to save the sign. It sat out in the elements for 60 years, and the script is hammered tin. So the word Pandora, the P is bigger than I am. It's really a hazard. It's hard to restore. It's hard to work with. So what we did is we restored the word sweaters, home of Pandora sweaters. We felt that's a key element. The letters are about 4 feet high. A great local company called First Signs fixed up all the neon, and it's now mounted on the wall in the middle of the exhibit. So when you walk in, there's no question what this exhibit is about. Sweaters right in front of you.
But the actual Pandora sign is gone.
It was stored in a barn in Auburn for many years. Our good friend Ann Milne allowed us to use space in her barn.
Yes.
And when I first came on the job, just 6 years ago now, she said, could you think about getting rid of the sign or fix it? So again, we saved the block letters that were far more structurally sound, and we use those. And when this exhibit ends in August, that sign will be mounted in the permanent exhibit in the museum in the room we call our loom room. There's a perfect brick space for it to go. So it will become a part of our permanent collection.
Wow. Wow, that's great.
You know, John, I'm sure you know this, but the script for the word Pandora is May Gruber's handwriting, if I'm not mistaken.
No, you are correct. It was. And it's, quite elegant script.
You guys know so much.
Well, she wrote it out for the sign makers to replicate. And just because this is Manchester, when Jeremy Hitchcock started the company Dine with his wife Elizabeth, they went to May Gruber and asked her to write the script for the Dine sign, which stood atop the building until Oracle came over and bought them out. So that had a good 10-year run. And the letters were bigger than the Pandora letters, too, but that was May's script as well. And she lived to be 102.
Yeah, I remember. She lived to a very ripe old age. What a formidable lady she was. Yeah, you don't want to tangle with her.
That's the word, Bob. Formidable. She certainly was.
Yeah, she was.
Well, she was a great patron of the arts, supporter of Dr. Selma Deitch and the Child Health Services.
Yeah.
Did a lot of work far beyond her professional work to make Manchester a better community.
Yeah, she was very civic-minded. We owe her a big debt of gratitude for all she did.
And we have her book at the Milliard Museum gift shop. It's called Pandora's Pride.
Yep. I have not read that. You should probably get that.
You should. Yeah. The reason they came to New York, from New York to Manchester in 1940 was because she was in a battle with the textile unions in the city.
Yeah.
And her then husband at the time said, we're out of here. They literally packed up and drove to New Hampshire overnight and moved into the iconic Pandora building.
My goodness. Such fascinating stuff. And what's your next exhibition going to be?
We're doing two. One is on the sculptures of a Manchester man named John Rogers, whose miniatures were hugely popular through the late 1800s into the 1900s. They were made of clay, so they were affordable. So a family could afford to have one of these pieces of art in their home without breaking the bank. But the one I'm most interested in is on the Queen City Athletic Hall of Fame. I recently came into possession of the plaque that lists the first 144 members. There were 213 total. And when it was given to me, I said, this could be a basis for a great exhibit. It will be, and it will be displayed. The problem is there is no repository of photographs of the very disparate 213 people who have been inducted, my wife included, by the way. So I have spent the last 3 months trying to acquire photographs of these great athletes, male and female, in their salad days, whether it was in the 20s or 30s or 40s. I'm seeking out action photos, not pose photos.
How do you find these things? You just put it out on Facebook if you got any photos?
I've done that. My former wife came in to visit the other day with a group of retired teachers, and she looked at the list and she said, you know every single person on the plaque, and I do. So I'm cajoling, I'm begging, I'm borrowing, and my former doctor, Ken Thomas, just retired. He had an array of sports photos on his wall, and I went over and visited him in Bedford, and I walked out with a dozen pictures.
Yeah.
I got a call, Scott McQuaid from the McQuaid's department store. I got his swimming photo of him in the pool. He was a great swimmer. And I scanned it, put it back in the envelope. It's on its way back to him. So this is a great test for my networking capabilities capacity.
You can be the Ken Burns of Manchester.
And I got to get more female athletes. So they're disproportionately represented. There are probably 5 men for every 1 woman. And personally, I do not want to be hanged in this lifetime, so I cannot open an exhibit with a 5-to-1 ratio. I need to get more female athletes. Fortunately, my wife is one of 4 Kelly girls who are in it, so I've got all 4 of those photos.
They're all very athletic, I know.
But I can't get away with putting just those 4 up there. So I've brought a lot of people into the process. So it's every day. If I get a couple of photos a week right now, because I'm looking to do something in September, hoping we can have a gathering. This is an untapped market for us. Most of these people are not engaged with the museum.
Yeah, they would be very interested.
This is my way to bring them in. Who doesn't want to go see a picture of themselves on the wall in a museum?
Yeah, right.
Mona Lisa would pay to go see the Mona Lisa.
Well put. You know, you're so focused on Manchester. You know more history than any of us will ever be able to forget. But do you deal with other museum directors? Do you have an association that you're part of? I mean, how do you get the?
I do not. There is a group who are members of the New England Museum Association, and I use that opportunity, that museum gathering, as an opportunity for my staff to benefit, to go to seminars, to go to meet their colleagues and do that. I don't need that at the stage of my life. I think it's more important for them. But we have an informal network. Alan Chong, obviously, we're very close at the Courier Museum. I just had a connection with the PBD Essex Museum.
Oh, yeah, that's a fine museum.
Well, they have a beautiful John Rogers statue, which we would like to use for our new exhibit that they don't display. So I just went through the very arcane process of asking them if we could have that on as a donation or a long-term loan, because they have no intention of displaying it again. So in this really collegial, this collegial, cordial thing, the director's name is William Monk. I wrote to him and asked if he would consider allowing us to use it for the exhibit or have it. And I got a very nicely worded letter back. There are what we call De-Accession Processes. If something is in your collection, there are very important legal steps before you could allow someone else to use it. Accession is acquiring, De-Accession is getting rid of things. So my hope is that, come September, when that exhibit opens, we'll have that particular John Rogers. There are 3 of them in the New York Metropolitan Museum.
Really?
That's how well regarded his work is.
Really?
And he worked in the Amuskeg machine shop. That's how we got to start.
Wow. Well, John, I just really appreciate it when you come in and lend yourself to us for an hour, and it goes by so fast, and it's just always fascinating. I'm a history bug, as Mike is, and Mike, with his record on the Heritage Commission, has made a real contribution to the city as well.
Well, people should know there was also a slight element of extortion involved in my appearance here tonight. Your membership had lapsed.
Oh, you're going to tell that tale on me, are you?
So I reached out to you, and you called me about something else, and I thought, he's going to ask me to be on the show tonight. And that's when I said, by the way, your membership lapsed. And then he called me yesterday to be on the show. So it wasn't quite extortion, but there were elements.
And I want everybody to know my membership is now up and current.
Yes, it is.
And I won't let that happen again. That was really great. So, okay, I guess we're going to wrap it up, Mike. Great show. Every time we have John Clayton here, got to do it again. You learn so much.
Absolutely. I can't wait to be in the studio with you, Bob. We're on the countdown. 3, 2, 1. It won't be long.
I'm looking forward to it. You have no idea.
Boom. When you were in the other room, I thought you were done.
But we are now.
We are.
Okay.
Good.
Hey, next week.